Now, Roosevelt felt differently. And he campaigned on this and won. And Roosevelt was, he had his own set of economic advisors, and they more closely followed John Maynard Keynes. Keynes' idea is that no, you can't just the government can't just stand by and let this thing try to solve itself. When we were looking at aggregate demand and supply, we looked at this a little bit about how if you wait long enough, wages fall and things shift over and we get back to full employment. But Keynes said, if you wait that long, we'll all be dead. In the long run, we'll all be dead, is the quote that he is famous for. And he said, no, it's actually appropriate for government to go into debt and to stimulate demand, in today's parlance, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And Keynes' ideas were currency to Roosevelt's economic advisors. They absolutely believed in this. So what they did was start massive government stimulus. Massive government stimulus. And you've probably heard about the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that went out and worked on national forests and trails and cabins and stuff. Tennessee Valley Authority they built a whole series of dams and all to bring electricity to rural Appalachia. Hoover Dam, a whole variety of works projects all over the United States, basically funded by the federal government. And when we saw in that graph, or if you see it on your piece of paper that you've got, if you see the GDP starting to rise, that's the result of those stimulative effects. Just like right now, the 3.5% annualized growth in GDP that we saw last quarter is probably due to the stimulus that Congress passed last winter. Same sort of thing, and keep going on its own. And then Keynes argues, and we are going to go back and talk more about this next week, I think. Let me double check, I think that is next week. Yeah. What we'll do, what Keynes argued is that, yeah, it's fine to have government stimulus, but only during really tough times. And then when things start turning around again, Keynes says you have to dial back the stimulus, reduce it, raise taxes, reduce government spending in order to pay back the debt that you incurred during your rescue times. That was a big part of his thing. Now and we'll talk about how politically difficult that is for congressmen and state legislators and stuff to do these days. But nonetheless, that was part of Keynes' thing. So Roosevelt did that, and he started the stimulus. Lots of work, both money going to private contractors to do things, but also a lot of people just became part of the federal payroll. Okay, now this is really a continuation of responses, and we'll come back here to see what Roosevelt had to do. So let's just call this more responses. We said earlier that one of the triggers one of the triggers that really started us sliding down into the Depression were these bank failures. Now, bank failures affect us in a couple of ways. Well, first of all, it's another way for people to lose their money. If there's a run on the bank or a bank fails and they shut their doors and you've got money on deposit there and there's no way you can get it out, so basically it's gone, poof, then that's another part of this kind of wealth effect. So people lost money. The ones who didn't invest in the stock market, there were some more folks who had just had money in savings accounts, and that went away. The other thing that you have with bank failures is a reduction in the money supply. Now let's go back and remember what we were talking about last week. On the plus side, we said, remember if I put in $100 into my bank, 10% of it would be saved and the 90% would be loaned out. that money would then flow into somebody else's bank, and we had this multiplier effect as high as 10. That's theoretical, pretty high number. We knew it's not really quite that high. It's not 10, it's maybe 5 or 6 or something like that. And it's because not everybody takes all the money that's loaned and just buys something with it. They might save some of it themselves. And sometimes banks won't loan out every last bit of what they can do. They might hold extra reserves more than the 10% they're required to. So the multiplier isn't necessarily as high as 10, but there is a multiplier. So what we were talking about last week was how money was created by the injection of money into the system. What was happening with bank failures was the reverse. What we're seeing is a bank if a bank failed and wasn't taken over by somebody else and its deposits and liabilities protected, those checking accounts or savings accounts went away. And so what we saw was a contraction of the money supply, and it shrunk by a multiple as well. Yeah?
The federal government at that time not insured accounts.
That's correct. At this point, early on, in the early 30s, there was no FDIC, no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which today insures accounts up to like $250,000. If you have, no more than $250,000, FDIC will step in and make you whole. We didn't have that back then. And in fact, the FDIC was started as a result of what had happened here. So what we saw was a drop in the money supply. Due to bank failures, and also due to the Federal Reserve is not acting quickly enough on failures. It's hard to say this in a bullet form, acting quickly. Let me explain what I mean. Early on, in the early part of the 30s, we were still in office, things are sliding down, people would like to think that stuff's going to go back up, and in fact, I think the stock market rose nicely, let's say within the month or so afterwards, but then slid back down. So there was but nonetheless, we had these early bank failures, and the Federal Reserve decided to take kind of a hands-off approach to that. They had some regulatory responsibility, at least for federally chartered banks. A lot of banks back there were chartered at a state level, and so there was, again, in defense of the Federal Reserve, there were some state banking bodies that could have acted differently and so on, but the Fed was really the one that had both the national scope and had the resources perhaps to do something about it. What they thought is that there ought to be sort of a survival of the fittest strategy. Let's let those banks fail. They were sick anyhow. And so the attitude within the Fed was, let's let those banks fail. That'll mean that the healthy other banks will have greater market share. They will be better off, and the whole banking system will be better. It will basically call out those weak banks. So they clearly had sort of a Darwinian approach here, thinking that if they just stood hands off, that it actually would result in a stronger banking sector after all the dust settled. But by failing to step in, they allowed the money supply to drop pretty precipitously.